Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fanfiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and lock your headphones and let the magic begin. Apostasy by Deydralinne, Chapter 14, The Fight. So what does that mean? Theo frowned, his arms crossed as he leaned against the kitchen counter. Now that they had all returned home, she had just finished reiterating what had been said in the prophecy. "Are you going to overthrow the Dark Lord and become the next supreme ruler of our world?" he attempted to joke. "She can't," Ginny answered firmly. "We both took oaths with Baldy that we weren't going to try and replace him or aid in his downfall." Hermione shook her head. "I don't want to be in charge anyway. I just want to steer the way and let him be the poster boy." She leaned back against the back of the dining chair, her fingertips peeling at the label on the water bottle. It was true. She didn't want total power, but she did have a vision for their world, and she had for quite some time. "He's going to take it that way," Pansy added warily, looking almost concerned for their safety. "What I want to know is why wouldn't Kingsley want you to take power? Why purposely ensure the good guys lose?" Daphne turned to face them. Since they had all returned to the French estate, she had spent most of the time listening and staring out the window. Hermione could see the cogs turning in her brain, trying to make connections with the missing pieces. Good is relative. He wanted power for himself. Draco eyed Hermione with fascination. He usually eyed her with fascination, but this was different, more intense. "Is that right?" His gray eyes pierced into her soul, setting her skin alight and the hair on the back of her neck standing at attention. "Right," Hermione agreed softly. Sometimes, when he looked at her, she could imagine that perhaps it wasn't all just her, that perhaps the invisible pull affected him too. "Kingsley has been making small plays to put himself at the head of the order, and everyone know he wants minister." Ginny shook her head. "Not even that he wants it. He acts as though he has the job, like he's earned it already." Hermione picked the last of the label from the bottle and began folding it. "We will need to report this to Baldy." Everyone straightened a little and gave her looks of varying confusion or shock. Hermione needed to gain Voldemort's favor. If he found out she lied to him about this or purposely kept it hidden, then trust would be broken and would never be regained. They had agreed never to lie to one another. She didn't want to be the Minister for Magic, not since she had begun utilizing the Unforgivables. She rather enjoyed the freedom to do as she pleased without the negative backlash that used to come with being on a pedestal. "Are you insane?" Blaise exclaimed incredulously. Hermione shrugged. "Maybe, but imagine how he will react if he finds out I kept this from him. Imagine how he will react if he finds out you kept this from him. I have a level of protection that you do not, and despite what you may think of me, I do not actually wish to see any of you dead. You are rather growing on me." "How touching," Leo smirked, earning him a withering look in response. "She's right. He can't kill her, but he could kill us." Blaise nodded in agreement. Hermione tipped her head sideways slightly, catching Ginny eyeing her cautiously. Hermione and Ginny already discussed her plan to create more rings, and they knew that they were playing a dangerous game right now. As it was, they had targets on their backs from some of the Death Eaters, and likely now would be targeted by the Order as well. Though only one of those posed any real threat. The Order had been staunch in its views on the Killing Curse, and ultimately, it would be their downfall. She knew that by being here in their house, they were taking on the most risks. So far, her and Ginny's rings had held off all attempts made on them, but their new housemates didn't have the same luxury. The way Tiberius looked at Theo at their meeting confirmed that they would be the ones to deal with any fallout. And given that Theo had already formed a soft spot within her in the short time that she had been here, she wanted to do what she could to protect him and the others. That didn't mean that she was ready to let them in on the plan just yet, but it would be at the top of her priority list as soon as they had set up the space for her experiments. That and finding a way to fulfill her promise to Voldemort to restore his face to be what it should be. She wasn't sure how badly Peter had fucked it up yet, and the solution might be harder to find because of it. Her teammates weren't the only house members that she was concerned about. Even though it seemed cocky, potentially arrogant even, she believed that she was smart enough to find a solution to Astoria's blood curse. She had spent much of her time at Hogwarts dumbing down the extent of her intelligence, something that she was no longer prepared to do. Was it bold of her to assume that she could undo a generational curse that had plagued the Greengrass family for centuries? Yes, probably, but she still believed that she should be able to do it anyway. Another thing she wasn't quite prepared to let the others in on just yet. She didn't want to get Thea's hopes up while there were still too many variables involved. The youngest of the Vaughns was noticeably absent today, and Hermione could only suspect that it was because her health was not the best. Blaise had mentioned that some days were better than others, and a part of her had not expected to see a bad day quite so soon. At the risk of making it seem like she was prying, Hermione kept her mouth shut and did not ask, while secretly hoping to catch a glimpse of the witch to get a better understanding of what exactly it was she was dealing with. "What time will we be expected to report back to Volster?" Ginny asked. Hermione scoffed at the nickname, and Draco choked on his drink. It had proven to be a reliable stream of entertainment, watching the overly cautious Draco try to adjust to the energy they brought. "He's hosting a dinner tonight for his closest and highest-ranked commanding officers. The guys will be expected to go, but the women are not obligated to attend," Pansy answered casually, clearly finding as much amusement in the situation as Hermione did. Daphne rolled her eyes. Of all of them, Daphne and Pansy seemed the least bothered by anything, treating their positions as a regular job. They weren't steadfast in their servitude to the Dark Lord like Draco or Blaise seemed to be, but they weren't along for the ride like Ginny and herself. She suspected that the dark marks on their arms came more from loyalty to their friends than the cause itself. In a way, she supposed it was no different from her staying with the Order despite her growing grievances. At first, out of loyalty to what used to be between her, Harry, and Ron, and then out of devotion to Ginny. At least here, Daphne and Pansy were clearly equally as adored. Had their little group been this way in school? It was hard to recall. She had been so caught up in the whirlwind that had been the Golden Trio and their attempts to defeat the man she was now determined to work with, a better world in mind. The trajectory of her apostasy within the wizarding world made her giggle. Perhaps it was her lack of humanity, or maybe it just came down to maturity and naivete. "Fantastic. I have a question for you," Hermione said quickly, sitting up and looking between them with one pursuit in mind. "When do I get my workshop? And as a follow-up to that, when can I play with Elizabeth?" Draco raised an eyebrow at her, his eyes locked on her. It was only here in this house that she saw him lower his guard a little, and she couldn't help but be drawn in. She was going to go crazy if he kept looking at her like that. Or better yet, "When can I fight you?" She directed Draco's way. Ginny snorted, "Yeah, fight." She shook her head and rolled her eyes. Draco smirked at her with glee. "You want to fight me, Granger?" The tone in his voice suggested that he knew she would get her ass handed to her, and if she was being honest with herself, the probability of such was high. What she really wanted was to fuck him, but she wasn't going to tell him that. Hermione shrugged, her skin heating under his roaming gaze that was assessing her as a threat. "Yeah, why the hell not?" Theo muttered something under his breath to Blaise, who snickered and nodded in agreement. And for a moment, she thought they were mocking what was clearly her obvious sexual attraction to the man on the other side of the room. But Blaise wasn't as quiet as Theo. Euron, 500, says he has her tapping out in less than 3 minutes. "You're both wrong," Ginny smirked before departing the kitchen and disappearing into the house. "Put me down for 300. I want in on Ginny's action." Pansy eyed her with amusement, the corner of her lips tugging up. "She didn't even say what her action was," Blaise debated. Daphne poured herself a glass of wine, the first, notably, that Hermione had seen her drink since their arrival. She didn't have to. Men are stupid and blind to the obvious. Daphne teased lightheartedly, pausing on her way past them to whisper something to them. Understanding slowly dawned on their faces before turning to her with piqued interest. Hermione rolled her eyes. "Fantastic. Just what she needed. Everyone in this house to know about her attraction to the man." It didn't matter, she supposed. At the end of the day, Draco wasn't stupid, and she was almost certain that he had picked up at least a little of the sexual tension rolling off of her every time he walked into the room. "You can fight me right now if you want, Granger." She wanted to punch the smug look off his face. "No fighting in the house," Astoria croaked from the doorway. Everyone in the room immediately turned to her. Hermione was right. Astoria was not having a good day. Her skin was nearly translucent, and she was so pale. Hermione's heart lurched at against the door frame, her bony fingers wrapped around her elbows. Theo, who had been carefree and goofy so far, straightened and rushed toward her. "Baby, you're supposed to be in bed right now. What are you doing?" Hermione listened to the fear that had etched into his voice. There was a small splatter of dry blood on Astoria's neck that drew her attention. Theo wasted no time in swooping Astoria up into his arms, and despite the protest from the witch, "I want to be around people. Please, I don't want to sleep anymore." Her pleas gave Theo pause to search her face. "Everyone relocate to the lounge," Theo started. "No, I want to watch their fight," Astoria frowned. Daphne started. "No, I want to watch them. Theo can carry me there, and I'll sit the whole time, I promise." Her voice cracked at the end, dropping in volume, which indicated to Hermione that perhaps Astoria was more scared of what was happening to her than she was letting on. Her eyes lacked the sparkle that had been there the day prior, and it was easy to see why everyone jumped to accommodate her request. Draco cleared his throat. "I'm not much in the mood for fighting, Tor." Hermione watched as Astoria deflated in whatever excitement she had managed to muster before, and it broke her heart. She had said she still had a good few years left, but that seemed optimistic looking at her now. Hermione frowned and stood suddenly. "Well, suck it up, because it's happening." She felt several pairs of eyes on her, but she was only looking at Astoria, who sighed with relief and peered back at her with a silent thanks. It was clear to Hermione that Astoria just needed some normality right now. "Well, all right then," Draco finally settled after looking between the two witches for a moment, pushing off the counter and stalking from the room like a predator. Theo frowned at Hermione in deep contemplation before giving her a small, subtle nod of appreciation. Ginny was already waiting at the edge of the outdoor training mat by the time everyone else made their way out. Her red-haired friend took one look at Astoria and summoned a pillow, which she transfigured into a small sofa. Draco rounded on her the second her foot stepped onto the mat, swinging with a punch aimed at her head, but Hermione was quicker. Dodging out of the way, she used the opening to her advantage by landing a punch to his ribs hard enough to push him back a step. Draco's foot swooped out and knocked her off her feet onto the ground. Over the years, Hermione's instincts had developed to a point where certain solutions had become second nature to her, as was the way with the knife she threw at him, barely missing his cheek. Her foot came up between them, and she prepared to kick him in the stomach. This time, it was Draco who was faster, diving her over in a roll, landing on his back in the dirt above her, his head next to hers. He reached back with both arms, wrapping underneath her chin, and pulled, closing off her air supply in an attempt to make her pass out. Hermione decided to take a play out of Draco's book, kicking her legs up over her body and pushing her shoulders further into the ground to roll over the top of him, coming down to land with a knee on either side of his stomach, straddling him. The force of her actions broke his hold around her throat. She pulled a secondary knife from her holster and pressed it against his throat before he could dislodge her. The blade kissed snugly against the skin, pulling a slight hiss from him and freezing him in place. It only dug him further when he licked his lips, moving his throat and jaw beneath the blade. He stared up at her in an impressed pride, eyes twinkling, his lips fighting against a grin. Hermione gave him a satisfied smirk and raised an eyebrow at him. "Granger, you need to get off of me." His voice was cool and clear. "Are you giving up already, Malfoy? We're only just getting started." She pushed the blade a little further against his throat as an incentive to admit defeat or fight back. Draco was fast, his hands snapping out toward her like a snake lunging at its prey and gripping at her hips. He didn't roll them sideways as she had anticipated. He just pushed her down so that her hips were aligned with his, her eyes widening at the feel of him hard below her. His hips rolled upward just to really make his point. "No, but if you don't get off of me or at least remove the knife, I'm going to want to fuck your brains out right here, so get off." Hermione struggled to swallow as fire erupted in her abdomen. "Get up or get off." "Get off?" she teased breathlessly while her eyes darkened. Somewhere closer to the house, she heard Ginny proclaim that she called it and would accept cash payment.